it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. 20 years from now, you'll be more disappointed by the things that you didn't do than by the ones you did. So throw off the bowlines, sail away from the safe harbor, catch the trade winds in your sails, explore, dream, discover, but also try to avoid situations like those in tonight's stories, 6 terrifying tales of urban exploration. And we begin our adventure with I Explored an Abandoned Asylum. All humans are driven by their curiosity. There's always a desire in our minds to explore the unknown, the mysterious, and get an adrenaline rush out of it. As for me, I get my adrenaline from urban exploration, which involves exploring structures that have been abandoned and left to rot, at the mercy of Mother Nature. Well, urban exploration is pretty popular nowadays, thanks to the internet. If you're an urban explorer with a YouTube account, there's a good chance that your videos will become viral. Exploration of abandoned places always has its dangers, and these dangers include collapsed floors and ceilings, police, gang fights, toxic mold, and carcinogenic fibers from old insulation. There are, of course, reports of paranormal activity in some of these places, which makes sense as some of these places have a very dark and disturbing past. Well, I myself had a run-in with the paranormal a few months back. At my university, I'm currently enrolled in a cinematography class to pursue my degree in film production. For Halloween, my instructor, Mr. Anderson, had assigned a Halloween-themed project. Our project was to simply create a scary short film. As a result of my hyperactive imagination, I came up with the idea of filming something that was terrifying in real life. I wanted to go ghost hunting at a haunted location, catch something scary on camera, and blow the other films from my fellow students out of the water. All the places I had explored up to that point had zero paranormal activity, but I figured my latest destination could change that. At the edge of town, on a giant hill, stands a complex of buildings that was once a lunatic asylum. There's no modern feel to its appearance. When you gaze upon the massive stone towers, you feel like you're right in the middle of a horror game. I'll present a little bit of history, but I'll try not to bore you with too many details. The asylum was constructed in the late 1800s under the Kirkbride plan created by Thomas Kirkbride. Now, Kirkbride believed that the insane should be offered large rooms, fresh air and sunshine to cure them of their illness. The asylum was meant to be a safe, comfortable place for the mentally ill, but it eventually became hell on earth for its patients. According to federal investigators, there were reports of patients breaking out of their rooms and going on murderous rampages, killing any staff members in their way. Suicide was common there, as some people hung themselves from the ceiling with bedsheets, while others dipped their heads in pots of boiling water stolen from the kitchen. The torture of innocent patients became the norm, as some were restrained for so long that their skin grew over their restraints. Some patients were forced to sit in baths of boiling hot or freezing cold water for hours on end. Well, some patients underwent lobotomies. In a lobotomy procedure, an ice pick would be shoved through the patient's eye socket and the frontal lobe would be disconnected from the rest of the brain. Some patients would become crippled while others would be reduced to non-responsive vegetables. The place was eventually closed in the 1980s due to abuse and neglect. Now, with the amount of security swarming the place, it's almost impossible to break in, but the few teenagers who've succeeded in doing so have told of all kinds of crazy stories, like slamming doors, floating heads, glowing eyes, moving wheelchairs, and disembodied screams. One of the hallways in the building has been nicknamed the Shadow Hallway, because shadowy apparitions supposedly roam this place. Now, as much as I wanted to explore the place, I didn't want to be an idiot and face charges for trespassing. Luckily, my best friend Dennis is the sheriff's son, so I asked him to pull a few strings for me, and it worked. The razor wire gate at the entrance was unlocked for both of us, and I had the sheriff's note of permission in my pocket, in case we were confronted by a security guard that didn't get the memo. Now, Dennis came with me because we'd partnered up for the project. Being a history buff like me, the chance of exploring an abandoned institution over 100 years old was too good of an opportunity to pass up. He researched the history just like I did, and printed a copy of the old campus map off the internet, so so we would know which building was which. We decided to explore the main hospital building first, since it was massive compared to the other buildings. Well, once we were inside, we were absolutely blown away by the condition of the interior. The inside was in near perfect condition, as if it had been closed just yesterday. Thanks to the efforts of the police, nobody had a chance to vandalize or spray graffiti on the walls. The ceiling hadn't collapsed, which was a blessing because I didn't want wet pieces of rust to fall on my neck. The only damage we could find was just some peeling wallpaper. Everything inside was left behind when the hospital closed. Wheelchairs, beds, syringes, gurneys, medical equipment, and papers were scattered in almost every room. After half an hour, we found the electroshock therapy room, where many patients had met a painful demise, as they were given often high levels of electric current that their bodies could not handle. Dennis pointed to the wall. "Dude, look!" I looked at the wall. Attached to it were 2 thick electric cords. Dennis glanced at me and grinned. "All the money in the world wouldn't convince me to plug my arms into those." "No kidding," I replied. We left the therapy room and started walking down yet another dark hallway. The building was literally like a giant maze. We both saw it at the same time. A giant dark shadow rose out of the floor. Its green, glowing eyes flashed like headlights as it stared at us. My hands were shaking with excitement as I pointed my camcorder straight at the thing. It eventually turned its head away from us and sank back into the floor. "Did you get that on camera? Please tell me you got that on camera," Dennis exclaimed. I smiled. "Yep, sure did." Dennis high-fived me. "Oh, we're going to ace this project now. Our film will be the best in the class." Right at that moment, my camcorder shut off. I clicked the on-off switch multiple times with no response. "Oh, I can't believe this." "What?" "The battery died. This doesn't make any sense. I just charged it right before we left." Dennis shrugged. "Could be ghosts. Plenty of paranormal investigators have reported the same thing happening to their electronics. Plus, we got that ghost on camera, so we're still going to beat the other projects by a landslide." "Yeah, that's a possibility, and we still have the whole complex to explore for the night. A dead battery can't stop us." We eventually found ourselves in Ward D, where the most violent female patients had been kept. On each side of the hallway, the patient rooms had thick wooden doors with giant brass locks on them. And that's when it happened. Without warning, every single door simultaneously slammed shut with a series of loud bangs. And we froze. It appeared. There wasn't a flash of light, no misty fog, no stuff like you'd see in cheesy horror movies. She just appeared out of nowhere. She was wearing a simple, white hospital gown. Her skin was as white as a skeleton. Her eyes had no pupils, no irises, and no veins. They were just empty, white circles. A few wisps of blonde hair stuck out of her head at random angles, like strands of hay on a broom. She spoke. "You? Why are you two here? You're here to watch me suffer, aren't you?" Well, despite her terrifying appearance, her voice was smooth and sweet, dripping with honey as she spoke. We stood still, frozen with shock. She continued. "Doctors, both of you told me that you wanted to cure me, so I could return to society, but you were lying. I knew you were lying. Every time you locked me in an empty room, and every time you shocked me and burned my flesh, I saw that wicked look of glee in both of your eyes. You didn't want to cure me. I was just an experiment to you, a guinea pig for you to toy around with. And eventually you two got bored with me, so you wanted to have one last experiment. While I was fully conscious, you strapped me to an operating table. You wanted to slice my brain to pieces and watch me scream in the process. You wanted to kill me in the most painful way possible and enjoy my attempts to break free from the straps. And you succeeded." My eyes wandered to her hands, and I saw the object she was clutching in her right hand. It was an ice pick. She noticed me looking at the pic and smiled. And as she smiled, her face stretched itself apart like bubble gum. She spoke one more time. "You see, doctors, all I want is a little revenge. Is that too much to ask?" Her mouth then opened into a large gaping hole as she unleashed the loudest, most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard in my life, and I hope to never hear it again. It wasn't just your ordinary scream. Her scream entered my head, and it occupied all of my thoughts. It stirred up all of my fears and amplified them to the point it was causing waves of pain to travel throughout my body. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like she was an embodiment of fear itself. "Run!" Dennis yelled, as loud as he could. She rushed at us with lightning speed, and we ran down the staircases like the building was on fire. When we reached the ground floor, we took a leap of faith and jumped out of a window frame with no glass present. Once we were outside, she didn't follow us. "Is she gone?" Dennis's face was white with fear. I took some deep breaths. "It looks like it." Dennis pointed a trembling finger at the hospital. "I'll tell you one thing, man. I'm never going in there again. Whatever those doctors did, it made her evil." At this point, we were soaked with sweat as we walked home, looking behind us every few seconds. And yes, we had nightmares. Who wouldn't after experiencing what we had? I'm not going to end this story by warning you not to explore abandoned asylums, as most people are just going to ignore me and continue to do so anyway. I'm simply warning you to be cautious. Sometimes pursuing our hobbies can have unexpected results. Oh, by the way, if it was any compensation, we did end up getting an A+ on our film project. Urban exploration. My story began when I was 15 years old, living in the south of Wales in the UK in a town called Bridgend. Me and my friend that I'd known for a while, who'll be known as Jack for the duration of this story, to protect his privacy, developed a liking for derelict buildings that had been left to rot where they stood. We consider ourselves urban explorers. Now, for those who don't know, it's the act of exploring abandoned properties with no consent or permission. So as you can guess, it was a pretty risky job in the first place. Well, we'd been to many, many extraordinary places that we found, well, interesting to explore. This was until we went on our final exploration. It was summertime, the perfect time to explore, and we hadn't done it for a while. Well, me and my friend Jack got together after finding this very creepy-looking building, which we thought would have been our best outing yet. We thought. The place was an old, run-down farmhouse-type building, which looked like something straight out of a horror movie. It was great. It was behind an old railway track that was also not in use, so to get there we'd have to cross the tracks. We were worried about being seen, but luckily no one caught sight of us. We'd arrived at our destination, finally, and now we had to find a way in. We came to the large, white, sand-coloured walls that looked like they'd fall down at any moment. We knew this would be a dangerous job. We both looked at each other nervously. Neither of us was prepared for what was about to happen. We came to the old wooden door. It was lying on the floor, and it looked like someone had kicked it in. We thought that it was just a group of potheads trying to find a good location to hang out for the night. We didn't think much of it at the time. We stepped through the old doorway, out of the sunlight and into the dark corridor of the old farmhouse. We were hit with the old, mouldy, grey, musky smell that lingers in many, if not all, abandoned buildings. Well, we were used to it by now. I switched on my flashlight and was ready to explore this beauty of a find. We started down the first corridor and came to a large, dark room. This must have once been the living room. It was a big portrait with mould growing on all four corners, making its way in over the years. It was of a woman in a huge, frilly red dress and a very pretty headdress, and she was beautiful. The rest of the room was just filled with small piles of rubble and trash. There was a broken desk with nothing on it but a small candlestick with a tiny amount left in it. We continued into the next room. Well, it looked like the last room, but smaller. It had a large amount of foliage growing through the old wooden floorboards, and moss and mould everywhere. Most of the rooms were like this, so we began to think that this wasn't what we'd hoped for. Time was ticking on, and we'd explored most of the house, finding nothing but moss, mould, rubble, and small leftover items such as candles, a few items of clothing, lipstick, and a sewing machine that no longer worked. But there were 2 more rooms in the house we needed to look through, one of which was behind a large wooden door. It seemed to be the only door left standing in the house, and seemed to be in relatively good condition compared to the rest of the property. We left that room until last. We entered the only other room left to explore and found a small box labelled Jessica's Things, which seemed very intriguing. We opened the box to, find nothing. Nothing but a very small music box. Jack began to turn the lever on the side, and the box began playing Bar Bar Black Sheep, which we both recognized pretty quickly. Well, there was something off about this music box. Maybe it was due to its age, but the tune sounded a little off-key and, in a way, distorted. We wondered why there was nothing in this big box but a small music box, but we left it there and continued to the final room. We stood there nervously looking at the old wooden door, wondering why it looked how it did, in the condition it was in. We must have been there for about 2 whole minutes just looking and arguing about who would open the door and go in first. Well, after I'd been chosen to open the door, I pressed my hand against the cold wood. The door wasn't latched, but it wasn't far from it. It was open enough for me to just push it open. Well, this room was different to the rest. It looked the same, but there was something very, very strange about it. It didn't smell the same as the rest of the house. It had the faint smell of a woman's perfume. We didn't think much of it for some reason, maybe because we were really creeped out by the room itself. There was a closet at the back of the room and a few lit candles on the floor. Something wasn't right. We were scared, but we'd found somewhat of a jackpot for urban explorers. There was nothing in this room but the closet and the candles, and the rest of the room was the same as the others, with the mould and rubble. I slowly crept towards the closet. I was very nervous and jumpy at this point, and the floor creaked as I stepped closer to the closet. I didn't feel right. I'd come to the closet doors and reached out to grab the handles. I slowly and carefully opened the closet. And what we found there was not what we expected. There in the closet, alone, was a large, single, frilly red dress hanging on an old broken clothes hanger. The inside of the closet looked clean, as did the dress. Well, this didn't make any sense. From this point on is where things started to go horribly wrong. A few seconds after I'd opened the closet, Jack and I were startled half to death by the sound of a screaming woman. We were only 15, remember, so we wanted out. I slammed one of the closet doors, leaving the other open, which shook the closet. We ran out of the room and down the old, narrow staircase, and we reached the living room but couldn't see the sunlight beaming in through where we'd entered the property. Well, this spooked and worried us. I shone my flashlight around in the room as there was barely any light in there at all. I shone it across the portrait we'd found earlier, and what I saw was unimaginable. There was a huge red symbol splashed on the center of the painting. After a few seconds, I realized that this symbol was a pentagram. Well, now I was more than ready to leave. I just stood and stared at the painting, thinking of the worst-case scenarios of this situation. As I stood there, Jack and I started hearing a loud banging coming from upstairs. Neither of us wanted to check it, but as there was now no apparent exit, we had no choice. We slowly crept up the stairs, all the while hearing the banging getting progressively louder and louder. We discovered that this banging was coming from the closet room, and now we were terrified. I stupidly started to open the door. I don't know why I went in. Maybe it was out of pure shock and not knowing what else to do. But I went in, only to find the closet violently shaking with both doors closed tight. I crept over to the closet and touched it, and it stopped shaking. I looked inside to find the dress was gone. I took a few steps back from the closet and was about to turn back to tell Jack what had happened, that we had to find an exit. And as I turned, I had the worst scare ever. Right in front of me was a figure. A female figure in a long, frilly red dress. I screamed and walked backwards, closing my eyes. I was petrified. The room was cold, and I heard the door slam shut. I screamed louder and then stopped. Everything was silent now. I didn't want to open my eyes. I didn't know what had happened to Jack, but I couldn't hear anything from him. Surely he could hear my screams and the door slam. My mind, however, was not on my friend at the moment. It was on the ghostly figure I'd just come face to face with. The room was still silent. I sat there for a few moments, and then I started to hear weeping. I was spooked out, too scared to open my eyes again. I sat there quietly waiting for the weeping to stop. But it didn't. I knew that if I didn't open my eyes, it wouldn't stop. So I gained the courage to open one eye, and then the next. I couldn't see anything, but the weeping sounded like it was in the room. I started towards the door slowly, and then, for some reason, I turned around. I guess it was instinct. When I turned, I saw the figure again. This time, however, I just stopped and stared. I had my bearings this time, and I realized that it was the woman from the portrait. I slowly opened the door without looking and ran out. I found Jack staring at the pentagram on the portrait, emotionless. I tapped him and called his name. Nothing worked. Well, I was in a rush, so I pushed him to the ground and he sort of woke up. I pulled him up and we both started to hear very loud sobbing and screaming, and we were terrified. We ran to the back of the house where we found an open door, much like the one we'd entered through. We ran and ran until the house was in the distance. We just dropped to the floor and got our breath back. We just sat there, looking at the house, recollecting the experiences in our heads, wondering what had happened to us. That night I couldn't sleep. I went online to research the house. It took me a very long time, but eventually I found it. I won't mention the name of the property, but I can tell you it was built in 1899. I also found something that gave me the chills. There was a family that lived there in the 1920s. The wife and mother of the family that lived there was named Jessica. I was spooked out when I read this. It made me think about the experiences I'd had in the house earlier that day. Had I seen the ghost of Jessica Watson? Was I crazy? What happened there? I kept researching and found that Jessica was murdered by her husband, Matthew. He stabbed her and slit her throat in the master bedroom. This must have been where the closet was found. Well, no one has lived there since the last Watson, the son of Jessica and Matthew, Harry, who died in the house of old age. He must have been keeping his mother's dress locked away in their old room, and it had been derelict since 1947 when he died. To this day, I don't know if the dress is still there in the closet. I don't even know if the house is still standing. One thing I do know is that I've not been urban exploring since, especially nowhere near the Watson property. Urban exploring in rural Canada. Rodney steered the van off the dirt path, listening to the newscaster on the radio. As the bizarre fungal infection spreads, we've gotten reports of cases in Texas and other U.S. states that border Mexico. This virus is believed to have originated somewhere in the Amazon, though its exact origins remain a mystery, she informed. Rodney switched the radio off as his destination came into view. Up ahead, at the end of the trail, he could see an abandoned school, its imposing stone figure not unlike a Middle Ages castle. "Oh, look at that! "I've seen internet pictures, but this place is downright terrifying up close," he exclaimed. Rodney had spent a great deal of money to fly himself and his 5 friends to rural Canada. "Looks spooky," stated Yusuf. "Hey man, could you retell the story behind this place? I wasn't awake the first time," requested Corey. "Oh, you always sleep, Corey. It's like you're some old man," complained Anton. "Okay, it's like this, see. This here is the Elf Hoof High School. This place was only in operation for one day. Tuesday, September 18th, 1997. On that day, 17 teachers were killed by some unknown slasher. The RCMP covered it all up, closing the school down for good. It's still a cold case. With witnesses reporting a woman in white wielding some sort of sword, though the RCMP refuses to talk about her," informed Rodney. "Well, we're here to solve this mystery," he announced. "Hey, did you all remember to bring a camera?" Raymond inquired. "I got it. I'll be the cameraman for this fiasco," replied Kevin. "What are we waiting for? Come on, let's roll," said Corey. He stepped out of the massive grey van that they'd all rode there in, and the others followed him, beginning their ascent up the school's stone steps. Surrounded by a dense forest, with imposing mountains as a backdrop, the Elk Hoof High School was by far the scariest place Rodney had ever been. He ran a famous ghost hunting channel on YouTube, Rodney's Pack, a brave ghost hunting team willing to do whatever it took to please their fans. The school's immense front doors were unlocked, a fact that greatly surprised all of them. The 6 friends broke into the school, closing the door behind them. A long corridor faced them, lockers lining the sides of the walls. The school was lit by overhead lights, a fact that made Rodney nervous. Everything in the school shone with a clean sheen, as if someone were still living there. This isn't right, thought Rodney. A sudden crash came from somewhere in the school. Rodney gasped. "What was that?" shouted Kevin. He rushed ahead with the camera, eager to catch a ghost on film. The crash had come from down the hall, in the cafeteria, whose door stood ajar. Guys, I've got a bad feeling about this," muttered Corey. "Oh, come on, we can't let Kevin just run off on his own," said Yusuf, and the 5 of them pursued their friend. He'd run into the cafeteria, leaving them behind in his haste to get footage. When Rodney approached the door to the cafeteria, it slammed in his face. Someone had locked it, a person Rodney couldn't see, because the doors, windows were painted black. He pounded on the door to no avail. "Guys, I can't get in," he shouted. I could hear Kevin screaming on the other side, something clearly being wrong with him. His screams soon began to grow faint, and the others pounded on the door. "There's no way of beating this down. Did any of you bring a pry bar?" Raymond inquired. Rodney was about to respond when a door banged open down the hall, thudding hard into the wall as it was tossed open with great force. "Someone's messing with us. I'm going to have a word with this prankster," growled Anton. He stomped towards the end of the corridor. "Hey, enough's enough," he shouted, angrily punching a locker. His friends trailed behind him. "Step out here, now," he screamed, approaching the end of the corridor. Anton barged into an empty classroom. As he stepped through the door, his foot came down on something. Moments later, he fell to the ground, screaming. His 4 friends arrived to discover that Anton had stepped on a steel bear trap, its teeth buried in his leg. "Oh, crap!" exclaimed Corey. He reached down to try and free Anton from the trap when someone stepped out of a closet at the back of the room. "What on earth?" stated Yusuf. A woman had stepped out of the closet. She wore a long white dress, with a sword hanging from her side. Her cold eyes had a deranged look to them. She sauntered slowly over to them, drawing her sword with a flourish. All four friends screamed, falling over each other to escape, leaving Anton behind, who sat quivering on the floor. "Hey, lady, get back. I'll rough you up. I mean it," he shouted. The woman in white waved her finger in his face. "That's a terrible thing to say. Didn't your mother ever tell you you shouldn't hit women?" she scolded, driving the point of her sword into his chest. "I'll need to punish you. A little thug like yourself needs harsh correction, if he ever hopes to be a real man," she lectured as she watched Anton die. As his friends ran for their lives, the woman in white took a remote control from her pocket, hitting a button that caused a building-wide blackout. Inside the cafeteria, Kevin sat strapped to a chair. He struggled against his bonds, trying to escape, before the crazy woman returned. She'd vanished into the kitchen, after which he had heard screaming. Kevin wondered what had happened to his friends. He could hear sprinting in the hallway, as well as panic shouting. "Guys, I'm here. Help me," he screamed, but they ignored him. The woman in white emerged from the kitchen. She carried something with her. Kevin recognized it with horror. A bottle of lighter fluid. "What are you going to do with that?" he gasped. The woman smiled. "Oh, you know, up here in the frigid north, one requires a fire to keep cozy at night," she informed him. Without warning, the woman sprayed lighter fluid into his face, burning Kevin's eyes and soaking him from head to toe. He gagged on the toxic fumes as the woman poured a trail of fluid across the floor. The trail led to a folding chair, which she sat upon. Kevin looked over at her. "Why?" he shouted. "You know why. You're like a mad dog needing to be put down," replied the woman. She sparked a match, igniting the end of the puddle, and then watched as the flames crept forward. Kevin thrashed harder than ever, to no avail, screaming as flames engulfed his body. The woman watched him burn, and then rose from her chair, abandoning the charred body. Raymond dove into a locker, while Rodney, Yusuf, and Corey ran ahead of him. Yusuf tried to open one of the front doors, finding them locked. Raymond hardly dared to breathe, shaking in his hiding place. A woman hummed from down the hall, her shoes clacking against the floor. He could see her approaching as he looked through the slats in the locker. As she neared him, she laughed, peering into each locker as she passed, twirling her sword through the air. He knew he should run, but fear rooted him to the spot. They made eye contact, the woman letting out a twisted giggle. "I found you," she declared, stabbing through the locker door, straight into Raymond's eye socket. He hardly had time to scream as he fell from the locker into the waiting arms of the woman. "You're it," she cackled, dropping his lifeless body to the floor. Yusuf hid in the boys' locker room, along with Rodney and Corey. They'd run into the pool room, deciding to hide in a locker. Yusuf had been arguing with his friends, trying to decide if they should flee. "Listen, we have to get out of here. We need help," stated Rodney. "Okay, I agree. Let's make a run for it," Yusuf stated. All three men braced themselves to run past the indoor pool and then down the long hallway. "Okay, ready, set, go," screamed Rodney. All three burst out of the locker room. As he sprinted past the pool, Yusuf felt a searing pain in his leg, sending him sprawling to the ground. His two friends glanced behind them. "Oh my God," screamed Rodney. Yusuf looked down at his feet, or rather the lack thereof. His feet lay in a puddle of blood, having been sliced off. The woman in white rose from the pool, holding her sword. She had slashed Yusuf from her hiding place. As he tried to crawl away, his fingers scraping the wet floor, the woman in white dragged him into the pool. He screamed and flailed. She poured him beneath the water with her. Yusuf choked on foul-tasting water as the woman slit his throat, turning the pool crimson. Rodney ran down the corridor, he and Corey barricading themselves inside one of the classrooms. While Corey panicked, Rodney grabbed a paperweight from what used to be a teacher's desk. Using it to smash a window, he said, "Come on, we're leaving," diving head first out of the window. The woman in white laughed when she heard the breaking glass, making her way swiftly out of a side door to pursue her prey. Rodney and Corey thought they'd escaped, accelerating down the trail. "We're going to get help," Rodney stated. "What good would it do? Everyone's dead. She killed them," shouted Corey. Rodney shook his head, turning the radio back on. "Texas has gone dark. All U.S. military forces are withdrawing. Beware all who are infected. They are aggressive and will attack on sight. Avoid eating any crops from South America," informed the newscaster. Corey shook his head. "Man, what is this crazy crap? First our friends get killed, and now we have some virus to deal with," he shouted. Rodney was about to respond when the woman in white stepped out from the tree line ahead of them. She aimed a crossbow, firing a bolt into Corey's chest, causing him to lose control of the car. Rodney screamed as the car rolled towards the side of the road, where there was a steep hill. His world was going black as metal screeched. Rodney awoke with a gasp. Sitting up, he was now upside down. With a grunt, he kicked out the car's windshield, the glass shattering under the heavy blows of his boots. The car's radio blared, playing Green River by CCR, evidently having changed stations in the crash. As he pulled himself from the car, Rodney winced. His leg ached. He was certainly injured. As he limped along, the woman in white slowly followed him. "No. Stay back," he screamed as he fled. Rodney then tripped over a rock, smashing his face into a tree. Then he felt something sharp hit his neck. Upon plucking the offending object out, he found it to be a dart, his vision swimming and blurring as he passed out yet again. The shrill rock from the radio was drowning out the woman's footsteps as she approached. Rodney felt something sharp tighten around his neck. He groaned as he came to, finding himself standing on a stool with a barbed wire noose around his neck. Terror filled him as he glanced around him, finding his friends hanging from different branches of the tree. What did you do to them?" he shouted. Yusuf's body hung to his left, his bloody stumps dripping onto the ground. To his right hung Kevin, his charred body reeking. The woman in white stepped forward, holding a glowing branding iron in her hands. "No, get away from me," begged Rodney, but the woman ignored him, pressing the burning steel into his chest. Rodney howled as the brand left its mark, burning the letter R into Rodney's chest. "So this is how it ends. You can try begging, you can try screaming," she mocked. "We all know you'll be doing plenty of that," she laughed, kicking the stool out from under him. Rodney tried to scream when the barbed wire tore his throat, nearly taking his head off. As he bled out, the woman in white watched, sipping from a steaming mug, her pinky lifted in the air, enjoying a job well done. I am what you'd like to call an urban explorer. So yeah, what you'd like to call an urban explorer. Well, this hobby usually entails travelling quite a bit and then trying to find any abandoned structures or areas that are worth taking a look at. Sometimes I travel rather far from home, maybe even out of state, and then other times I go to other cities or go a few more miles away from where I live. This time, however, I didn't have that kind of benefit of travelling so far away due to the fact that the economy had gotten so bad and my job wasn't paying that well. Because of this, if I wanted to explore any abandoned places, I'd have to keep to the more local areas. I started urban exploration a few years ago when I first moved into my current house. I just settled in and looked through every room in the house, including the basement. But it wasn't long before I noticed something strange about the basement floor. In the center of the room, there was a small square wooden hatch with a metal handle attached to it. When I saw this, I thought there might be some storage area underneath, but what I found was much better than that. I opened the hatch and looked inside. There was a short metal ladder leading directly downwards to a room underneath. It immediately surprised me, but it also gave me great excitement at this discovery. I didn't expect to find a sub-basement, and such a thing isn't common in most homes. The room was difficult to see into as there was no light source inside, so I went and grabbed a flashlight from upstairs. I came back and went down the ladder while shining the flashlight inside. It was a small, narrow hallway with a storage closet, and there wasn't much else there. It was mostly empty, with a few bits of trash and blueprints lying around, but there wasn't any furniture or any other rooms. Anticlimactic, I know, but it didn't cease to amaze and excite me, as this was a great surprise. The place looked dusty and rather old, as did the hatch, and I assumed that this was an unused part of the house. Ever since then, I've been trying to find new abandoned areas to explore and satisfy my curiosity. On a weekend, I decided to prepare for my next venture. When I got back from the store, I did some research on the surrounding areas for any new locations for which to check out. Most of the research yielded the same places that I'd already explored long ago, but there was one particular area which I hadn't explored yet, and for good reason. It was an area I deliberately avoided because it was poverty-stricken, filled with crime, and mostly consisted of run-down buildings. It was the kind of place you would go several miles around to get to your job, just to avoid going through it. Normally I would stay away from such a place, and I actually did that for a long time. But I hadn't explored any new areas in several months, and I was getting anxious because my desire for exploration was at an all-time high. So I decided to push away any doubts or fears of this particular area so I could finally explore the remaining abandoned places that I hadn't been to before. The next Saturday, I drove my car up to that part of town, which was a few miles away, and I drove slowly around the neighborhood to see if I could spot any particular abandoned buildings that were both isolated and worth going into. Well, the town was just as I'd expected. Most of the structures had barred or boarded up windows and closed off doors. Those that were not like this were few and far between, and pretty much all of these structures looked old and run down. Some of these places looked like they'd been abandoned a long time ago, but I didn't want to explore them, considering they were surrounded by other inhabited homes and apartments. If I had decided to break into any of these places, there was a good chance that somebody from across the street or a neighbor might notice and possibly call the police. There was also the risk of running into some homeless people or some meth addicts living in these vacant lots. And this wasn't a risk I wanted to take, so I kept driving around, hoping I'd find some abandoned places that were somewhat isolated from the rest of the area. It took me a while, but I came across one particular road which led out from the neighborhood into a large but mostly empty field. I parked my car alongside the road, not too far from this road, and I hoped that my car wasn't going to get towed. I walked down the road for a long time, but it must have been just a few short miles from where I'd started, and the surrounding field looked relatively empty. There weren't really any buildings for the first mile or so, and there weren't any trees either. The field went all around in the different directions for several miles, and I kept going in a zigzag-type pattern. It took me around half an hour before I reached a small abandoned house which was completely isolated from any other structures or people. The only thing that surrounded it was the large unkempt field and the few bushes here and there. Well, this was a good thing because it meant that there was very little risk of me getting caught, and since this house was further away from the local area, I hoped it wasn't going to be filled with junkies or hobos. This would be unlikely, however, due to the very nature of such places, despite my wishful thinking. I approached the premises very slowly and carefully, as to examine if there was anyone else there. There was trash and evidence of inhabitancy lying all around outside the building, but I didn't see anybody inside from the windows. I went round the back of the house and went in through the door. Once again, I carefully went around the home to explore and to make sure that there was nobody there at the time. Thankfully, there wasn't anyone downstairs, but there was plenty of trash and debris lying around, just like outside. There wasn't anything valuable, though, as all the furniture and scraps of the home had most likely been taken long ago. Graffiti also littered the walls and various parts of the house, which showed that this was a popular spot for many other people. Once I'd finished searching the downstairs, I went around the back, where the staircase was at, and went upstairs. The area up here was pretty much the same as the rest of the house, and it didn't take me long to finish my search. I came upon the very last room, which appeared to be some kind of an office according to the various bits of paper and spare furniture parts lying around, and I stepped inside. Immediately, I was greeted by a disturbing sight in the far right corner of the room. The person's skeleton had been lying on the ground, and two things were in both hands. In the left hand there was a handgun, and in the other there was a note of some sort. I was struck with surprise when I made the discovery, but after some thought I figured it was to be expected in such a place. I was surprised because I hadn't found a body or a skeleton of any kind in my previous expeditions, and this was the first time I'd found such a thing. But the surrounding areas, like I said before, were notorious for crime and poverty, so finding somebody like this didn't seem completely out of place, but, well, some bit of surprise still took hold despite this. I tried taking a look at the note, but I couldn't read the vast majority of the person's handwriting due to time taking its toll and poor penmanship. But I was able to read the person's signature, and that was really all I could understand in the notes. Believe it or not, that was the first time I'd run into something like that, but it wouldn't be the last time. At first I thought it was just a strange and unfortunate finding, but it was later that I realized I was completely wrong. It wasn't long before I went exploring again, at another place, and it was here that I found another skeleton. This time it wasn't as clear as to their cause of death, but I wasn't so concerned with that as much as the fact that I'd found another dead person. They did have a note in their right hand, but reading it proved very difficult, and the signature was, once again, the only thing I could really make out. Now keep in mind that this was just after exploring the last place, which had also had a dead person inside. That was the second time I'd encountered a dead person's skeleton inside an abandoned area, and it was right after I'd found that first one. I went on another venture not long after the first two, and came across another abandoned structure which had a skeleton inside. Well, that was more than once, and I thought it was just a mere unfortunate coincidence. Oh, how wrong I was. Every single other place that I've explored since then has had a dead person inside with a note, either on them or near them. The means of death have been ambiguous at times and more obvious at others. The note would usually be virtually impossible to read, except for the signature, just like all the other notes. After a while it became too much, and I decided to take a long break from urban exploration. These discoveries were disturbing each time, and they never stopped. And that's why I thought something paranormal or sinister was going on, and that it somehow involved me. And that's what really frightened me, and I couldn't continue exploring any longer. But I still consider myself a rational person, so I tried to reason to myself that I was simply imagining all of this. I tried to tell myself that maybe all of this wasn't even real, and I just needed some medication or to see a doctor. But I haven't had a single issue in my past regarding mental illness, and I've never had any hallucinations before. And there was no way that I could have just kept on stumbling onto more dead people and a note, as there was no way this was just a coincidence. Well, that was just a week ago, but now something else has happened. I decided to use that sub-basement, the one I'd found a long time ago, as a storage area. Well, just an hour ago I went down there to grab some supplies for some work I needed to get done, and I noticed something immediately odd about the center of the room. On the ceiling there was a rope tied around a loose wooden plank, and it was shaped like a noose. When I saw this I felt fear striking the very core of my being, and I couldn't do anything else but to try and reason why that rope was there. There wasn't anybody else in the house, and I had no recollection of tying that rope, nor was it there before, so how could it have gotten there now? Well, I'm writing all of this down on a few spare pages of paper, just in case something happens to me. I think something very strange and terrifying is happening to me, and I don't know what it is. Be careful with rural exploration. If you've ever been an urban explorer, you probably have at least one experience that scared you senseless. For me, it was a few weeks ago. Oh, I've tried not to think about it. Tried to pretend it happened differently. Well, that, and the fear of something else happening after the fact, kept me on edge for a couple of weeks. Well, now I think I'm out of the woods. No joke intended. You see, I'm not so much an urban explorer as I am a rural explorer. I live in the deep south, far away from any large cities with old buildings. However, there are ghost towns and ruins and woods all over, worth checking out if you're ever down here. On this particular day, I was driving home from a relative's house and my GPS had turned me around. Well, I wound up on a one-lane dirt road, looking for an opportunity to make a U-turn. It was after a few minutes that I came across what looked like a dirt driveway. It was surrounded by trees on both sides, and a chain ran across the entrance with a bright red "No Trespassing" sign. I couldn't see too far in, but it looked like it had been unused for some time. Oh, I lit up. I got out and dropped the chain. From there I drove onto the path and rehung the sign to help avoid, being caught. The path was overgrown with grass and vines, lined with thick forest on either side. The ground was dusty, and the skinny brown trees provided a claustrophobic feeling. Bushes and stalks of tall grass scraped against my car. However, at the end of the trail was a clearing. It was a large circular field of overgrown grass in the middle of this distant woodland. In the center of the clearing was what appeared to be a large, desolate house. The house was 2 stories tall, and clearly huge for the era when it was built. The windows and doors were all boarded up on the first floor. The whole thing had a nasty grey-brown stain from the years of elemental exposure, but you could see that it was beautiful in its prime. I imagine the place had been abandoned for some time. There was no sign of electricity being run from the main roads. There was no sign of modern appliances being outwardly installed. And there was a rusty pump out front. From the architecture, it looked like a brothel one would see in old Main Street towns, but there were no other signs of any other buildings for miles. I approached the creaky and rotted front porch, looking for a way in. I found one of the boards loose on the front downstairs window. I peered inside for a long time before deciding to enter. The smell of rotten, musty wood blasted my nostrils. I'd smelled it enough times to be able to just ignore it. I was more concerned about chemical smells or cigarettes, indicating someone was there. But there was none of this. The entire bottom floor was bare. There was no furniture, no kitchen, not even walls apart from the necessary pillars. The entire main floor was just bare wood with dust and what looked like mud and other gunk in various states of decay. There was a main staircase leading to a second floor. It had several rooms and hallways going in both directions out of sight of the main floor. From the looks of it, this place may have been an inn. I pulled the board back as quietly as possible, since I always wanted to be subtle. You never know if a cop is in earshot, even in the most abandoned places. I crept through the window and dropped in. Dust was immediately kicked up, and I get a better view of the debris all over the floor. wood and rocks and housing materials all shattered and scattered about. I looked around from my now better vantage point. There was some light trickling in from holes in the roof and the non-boarded upstairs windows. They faced the front of the house, and were a rich maroon-stained glass. They cast a deep red tint, in contrast to the beams of yellow. I then realized something about the house I must not have initially noticed. The bottom half of the staircase was gone. It looked like it had been smashed away. The gap to the floor was probably the height of an average man. I could jump up there, but I wanted to see the downstairs first and make sure I was clear. I watched my steps carefully as I made my way to an alcove room, which was probably a sitting area. It was there I saw something else that I'd missed. In the back of the alcove was a doorway leading downstairs. It must have been a basement or cellar of some sort. It was pitch black from the frame onward. I reached for my phone and cursed under my breath. Oh, it was still on the charger in my car. I guess because there was no service, and that I stumbled on this place during the daytime, that I didn't even think to grab it. I turned to go to the opposite direction, towards the empty kitchen room. I was almost there when I heard an unmistakable noise. Footsteps. They sounded like a pair of heels or dress shoes coming in rapid succession, growing louder as they reached the doorway. It was out of my line of sight, as the alcove curved out from its own corner. There was no way to see it, until it emerged. At first, my brain wouldn't comprehend it. A dog? A bear? No. God, what am I seeing? Oh, God, I muttered. From the corner emerged a massive, hairy monstrosity. It was the tusks that gave it away first. This was a boar. A huge, black, rancid-smelling boar. By the looks of it, he must have easily doubled me in size. His tusks were long, and bits of his matted, wiry hair gave way to deep scars. And then it turned to face me. Now, if you've never encountered a boar in the wild, well, they can vary in size. However, they are all dangerous. They have sharp teeth, a violent charge, and will most likely consume you if they're hungry enough. These things are demons of the forest, and I had never seen one apart from in tree stands or mounted as trophies. This one towered above all of those. I sucked in air, waiting for a reaction. It bent, snorted hard, and planted its feet. In a split second, I knew my only safe bet was a clean jump to the staircase. I bolted to the right as the beast charged. Its tusk nearly pierced my leg as I jolted away. I took one running leap, and my arms connected enough to pull myself up. I rolled up a few extra steps and heard its hooves slamming the wood below me. It was shrieking and snorting and kicking up dirt and debris in a fit of rage. And that's when I started laughing. It wasn't a good-natured laugh, but a panic attack manifested in the form of mania. It stopped after a short spell. I then took a deep breath and continued up the staircase. At this point, I was going to have to wait until the commotion downstairs had ceased to be able to find an exit. The banister at the top of the staircase extended to a wall in both directions. From there, it was a hallway with rooms on both sides. I made my way to the right. I noticed some rooms had doors and that others didn't. I chose the first door to my right. It had a door that was cracked about the width of my body. Inside was old, rotting furniture. Dressers, bed frames, doors, and cabinets were all stacked haphazardly in a pile. Behind it all was a small gap, and an unboarded window facing the roof, its bottom half missing. I was standing in the doorway when I heard a noise that made my blood run cold. A creak. A long, drawn-out, ominous creak. The mild scare was then punctuated with a nauseous fear by the sound of a muffled cough. It was coming from the end of the opposite hallway. I quickly and quietly made my way into the room and hid behind the pile of wood and garbage. Thankfully, the bore was still slamming around downstairs, so my mistakes were masked. I had a small hole in the pile to see the doorway and slightly into the hall. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it was audible. My lungs were on fire, and I could feel my eyes moisten. The birds outside the window had gone completely silent. I then heard a now familiar sound. I heard hooves. I heard the exact same clopping I'd heard just minutes ago. Another one, I thought in a terrified moment. The clops grew closer. I strained my eye to see into the hallway, hoping the noise would stop or go the opposite way. God, it heard me laugh. Oh, it definitely knows I'm up here. It was in that moment of brutal tension that I saw it. The unmistakable snout, led by two long tusks. It kept moving, revealing fur and a snarling mouth. However, it then made my mind readjust again. It didn't have eyes, rather just shrunken, dried holes with nothing behind it. Its skull curved in a way that boars don't usually curve. At the back of its head looked to be a leather strap, and then a different color of hair, and then flesh. Then I saw the hooves, bloody and crudely detached above the base, the empty fur pulled up around a man's wrist like a rotten leather glove. He was naked apart from the severed boar's head and hooves. He walked on his hands and feet. He made no noise other than a few hoofs. Dried blood caked the areas of his pale flesh where the body parts were worn. He was emaciated, but still large enough to easily be a threat. I don't know how to explain it. It was so weird, so vile, that I still can't wrap my head around it. He moved his head into the room, but after a few seconds that felt like hours, he turned around, his body in a contorted curve as he balanced his feet and hands in the severed hooves. He clumsily clicked his way down the hall and out of sight. In this moment, I had two options. I could risk the stairs and the boar, or take the window to the roof and risk the masked psychopath being on my heels. Well, I had my mind made up for me. It was then I heard a shriek so inhuman that I've had nightmares about it ever since. It was sharp and high, but muffled and resounding. It sounded wet, but also wheezed. It was followed by rapid clopping on the wood. It was coming right for me. I scrambled clumsily out the small opening at the bottom of the window and rolled out onto the roof. The drop was a risk, but it was the only way to get out fast. I heard the stomping enter the room, and I let myself down as safely as I could. By some miracle, I rolled onto the ground with nothing worse than having the wind knocked out of me. Without turning back, I scrambled to my feet and bolted for my car. As I opened the door, I heard the shriek again. I heard the monster downstairs slamming into the front door. I heard the creature upstairs slamming into the window and screaming its putrid lungs out. Without looking back, I slammed my car into ignition and sped off. I skidded through the grass towards the path. I ripped down the post holding the chain as my car burst back onto the dirt road. I raced back the way I'd come and found my way home in a shaking panic that lasted for hours. I spent that night wide awake. That was the end of it, although I really don't get it. I don't get why a person would live in such squalid conditions, to live out a fantasy that makes sense only in their mind. I just don't know. What I do know is if you do this stuff in the country, just be prepared. You may not meet a gang member, or a drug dealer or a junkie, but you may just meet something far more dangerous. You may meet something that defies all reason. You may meet something that would eat you alive. The Sealed Building.
When I was a child, the school which I attended was peculiar, yet wonderfully interesting. Whether it was the fact that it was surrounded in places by overgrown bushes and opposite a strangely crooked wood which ignited my imagination, or perhaps the funny, eccentric, and sometimes fearsome teachers and kids which populated it, I do not know. I'm not sure of when it was built, but it certainly stood out from the houses and quiet streets which surrounded it, covered as it was in a bright, fiery red paint which drew your eyes to it immediately. There I went, from the age of 5, up until I was 11 or 12, and, like most children, I have both fond and cruel memories of it. Each day, with a rucksack on my back, I would wander past the crooked wood and wave to the lollipop lady, Mrs. Collins, a kind old woman whose job it was to stop traffic with her bright yellow sign, letting us cross in safety, and, after meeting my friends, walk through the rusted brown gates into one of 2 playgrounds. It was rumored that in the past the 2 grounds existed to separate boys from girls, both an understandable and utterly outdated concept. By the time I went to the school, the first playground had been assigned for those aged 5 to 8, the second for those aged 8 and up. In the older kids' playground, there lay a small, red brick building which stood on its own, disconnected from the main school complex. It had long since fallen into disuse, and in fact had been sealed from prying eyes, its doors and windows walled up with stone and mortar, making it impossible to see what was inside. Its purpose seemed a bit of a mystery, as most of the teachers seemed to skirt around the subject entirely. But of course, stories spread amongst the wild imaginations of children. And in my school, this fondness for outlandish tales of tragedy and forbidden places often led to bizarre rumors and whispers, particularly pertaining to the sealed building. Obscurity is a fertile ground for the fantastical ruminations of youth. When my friends and I were in the younger playground, we would sometimes sneak down a narrow passageway which would lead to the other and peek around the corner. There, we would see the older kids playing football or just hanging around. It's amazing how younger children look to their older peers, thinking that they seem to be having so much more fun than us. But before we'd be chased away by the janitor or a passing teacher, my eyes would always lead to that sealed building. There was something lonely about it, isolated, and while it was surrounded by the yells and vibrancy of a schoolyard, its appearance suggested a grave silence to me. Some of the older kids liked to scare themselves and us, and told us dramatically that it had been used as a science department, and that there had been a hideous accident there, one which had produced strange and gruesome things which had to be kept from the world. Even as a child of 8, I knew made-up nonsense when I heard it. Then there was the account that it had been a previous and rather brutal head teacher's office decades earlier, and that he had died there in a fire. His ghost obviously still haunted the place, and it was better that the vengeful old sod be contained there, fuming at his desk as children enjoyed themselves and played nearby. Again, utter garbage. There was, however, one account of why the place had been abandoned, which seemed more plausible to me. The building was, in fact, a toilet. Yes, a normal toilet. No frills, no secret laboratories, no dead spirits of an overbearing head teacher. It had simply been sealed up when new facilities were installed in the school to stop the children from climbing inside and getting up to mischief. But yet, despite this mundane explanation, there were still in fact tales to be told about the red-bricked, disconnected building in the older kids' playground. Although I had heard the stories, it wasn't until I was in my 4th year with the school that I became intimately, and, at the time, uncomfortably involved with it. The older kids' playground was flanked on 3 sides by a rectangular section of the school itself, with the 4th side separated from neighbouring houses by a mouldy and dark red wall. It was isolated from the other playground, other than the aforementioned passageway, and, to further the feeling of imprisonment, was characterized by tall metal fencing, which rose up in places where a brave classmate might have attempted their great escape. Yet, there was one old gate which did allow access of sorts, but like prison guards, the teachers tended to check on it regularly. There, in the corner of the grounds, lay the old building. Its windows were indeed enclosed in brick, as were its 2 doors. But the roof seemed unusual to me, being flat in places and surely gathering puddles of rainwater during the wetter seasons. I was, at that age, and embarrassingly still to this day, terrified by heights, and it was much to my horror when I discovered that climbing up onto the roof of the toilets was seen as a rites of passage of some sort. Don't misunderstand me. We weren't forced to go up there, but children can be cruel, and when someone new to that playground showed weakness or fear, this would often result in them being picked on. Over the coming weeks, I watched as each of my friends climbed up onto the roof when the opportunity presented itself, dangling their legs over the sides nonchalantly once up there, one by one, claiming their right to be in the older playground, while I succumbed to ever-increasing taunts about my fear and cowardice. Don't believe me when I say I did try. Several times a ball would be kicked accidentally onto the roof, and my classmates would turn to me to retrieve it. I even made it up the side of an old drain pipe on a few occasions, far enough to reach my hand up and over to touch the roof's surface. Yet, each time, I would fail. Fear would grip me, and with each admission of defeat, the name-calling and embarrassment intensified. I can trace back a curious and probably detrimental aspect of my personality to that time. You see, failure in front of strangers to this day does not bother me. But friends, family, even acquaintances, the very idea makes me break out in a cold sweat. Later in life, I followed the stereotypical path of chasing fame as a teenager, and I would have no problem playing in bands in front of those I did not know. But put a familiar face in the audience, and my nerves would take hold. The stakes of failure would be raised that much higher, in my mind at least. For this reason, I chose an odd time to truly face my fear. One day, after school, I waited outside the gates, watching as the other children slowly siphoned out of the two playgrounds, kicking their feet through the autumn leaves. Parents escorted the youngest of my fellow students, while those of an older age walked with their classmates, some eagerly, others not so, making their way down the hill, past the woods, to their homes in the surrounding area. As the school became ever emptier, and the teachers themselves began to leave, I walked down the street, entering the gardens at the back of the building. I always found the rear of my school to be an interesting place. It consisted of shrubs, bushes, and an old ash football pitch. Our teachers never seemed to use the area for anything, and we were actively encouraged to keep clear of it. Again, there were stories amongst the students that a child had been abducted while playing there years previously. Whether that was true or not, I do not know. Once I was as certain as I could be that everyone was gone, I sneaked through the bushes, up a small incline to the rear of the playground. There, embedded in the wall, was the narrow brown gate, which the teachers kept a watchful eye on, but as far as I knew, was never used. I assumed it had served a legitimate purpose years previously, but for me and my friends, it was the place where we would climb over to run around the school grounds at the weekend when no one was there. It was an exceptional place to play one-man hunt, with so many nooks and crannies to hide in. As cautious as I was, I wanted to truly attempt to get up onto the roof of the old toilets. In my 8-year-old head, I had visions of sneaking up there in the morning and surprising my friends, or running up there to heroically retrieve a girl's ball. In childhood, we think that those around us really care about our actions, but in truth, they are of little consequence to anyone other than ourselves. Yes, I had been bullied a little for not being as strong or as fearless as those around me, and that sense of public failure, of insecurity, while a potent sensation at a young age, while in hindsight completely exaggerated, was enough to give me the courage to at least attempt the climb. I'd considered asking one of my friends to join me, as I was nervous that a teacher might still be there, that I would get into trouble, and so needed a lookout. But this would only have given me someone to fail in front of. I decided to attempt it on my own. After waiting for what seemed an age, I slowly climbed over the gate, which rattled unnervingly under my movements, echoing out around the playground. Then, after hesitantly observing the hundreds of windows which dotted the school for movement, and happy enough with the absence of light emanating from them, I stepped silently to the sealed building. Even though I knew as little as an audience of one could affect my confidence. I partly wished that I'd not been alone, as the building and its deserted surroundings left me feeling uneasy. I knew, however, that if I just got up there once, that I would have conquered my fear and would be able to climb up onto the roof with ease in future, hopefully putting an end to the name-calling. I stood staring at the drain pipe, which would be my avenue to success, clinging as it did through rusted fittings to the side of the building. My mind back then was often clouded with the worst possibilities, focusing on the negative outcome. And, as I began to climb slowly, I imagined that the drain pipe would wrench away from the wall, throwing me against the concrete ground at any moment. The truth is that it did not move, no matter how much I believed that it did. Without a witness, I was now as far as I had ever reached, able to stick my hand up above me and touch the edge of the roof. My heart raced with excitement as I began to believe that I really could do it, that success was in sight. I then made the mistake of looking down to check my progress. The experience of height is something difficult to convey to someone who has no problem with it. While, in reality, I was probably no more than 7 or 8 feet off the ground, I perceived this as a monumental distance. I felt my stomach churn, my heart beat erratically, and the world below began to spin and distort. Worse still, a loss of nerve permeated my body, leaving me feeling weak, and I could feel my grip begin to loosen. It is strange how the mind works, for just as I was ready to admit defeat once more and retreat, the insults and jeers of my classmates rang throughout my awareness, as if they were present, down there, taunting me. With what was for me a huge effort, I found myself continuing to climb upwards, my hands reaching out to the damp roof, and then, before I knew it, there I was, letting out a laugh of excitement. A sensation of relief washed over me. I could not wait for the next day. To be up there on the roof, proving those who had been cruel to me wrong. Peeking over the edge, I still felt trepidation at the height, but nowhere near as much as I had done it before. My triumph quelling my anxiety. Still, I was not keen to remain there for long, so I decided to investigate my surroundings briefly, then climb back down to the safety of the playground and head home, ecstatic. The roof was painted in a similar fiery red color to the main school building, but it had long since peeled and cracked, suggesting that it had been a long time since someone had been up here to give it a new coat. Standing up cautiously, I felt my legs waver slightly as my stomach churned again at the thought of how high up I was. Laughable, really, as the height of the roof was probably no more than 10 feet. Yet, no matter how nervous I was, the sense of triumph which I felt coursing through my body was truly wonderful. I walked slowly from one side of the roof to the other, careful not to trip as I did so. The short walk from the drain pipe to the opposite ledge and back filled me with a feeling of conquest, as of someone patrolling their territory. For those brief moments on the roof, that building was mine. Just as I turned to finally make my way back to ground, I noticed that in the middle of the roof there was a hole. I'm not sure how I hadn't noticed it before, although it was quite small, big enough for me to fit my hand through and little else. Curious, I took a few careful steps and then knelt for a closer look. Yes, there was a hole, and the light from the evening sky passed straight through it, illuminating what lay inside. I put my eye as close as possible to the opening without blocking the light, and was surprised by what I saw. Down there, in the darkness, like a perfectly preserved tomb, the old-fashioned white tiling remained intact. I could see the sinks where students years ago once washed their hands or flicked water at one another for amusement, and 3 stalls, cubicles with strong, dark brown doors, lying there as if still used. The air inside was tinged with dust and age, yet if someone had told me that the building had been sealed only the day before, I would have believed them. All but for one thing: a layer of stagnant water which covered the floor, no doubt accumulating there from rain dripping in through the opening in the roof. Then I became aware of a strong smell, one which left my eyes stinging slightly and my mood apprehensive. Yes, there was no doubting it. Someone was smoking a cigarette nearby. My heart sank as I lay there motionless, cursing myself for taking too much time on the roof to celebrate my victory. A teacher, or perhaps the janitor, must have stayed behind to work late and was probably standing in the playground below. I thought they must have been close as the smoke smelled thick and oppressive. I lay curled up on the cold, wet concrete, waiting for whoever was there to leave. The now almost caustic smoke seemed to be increasing in strength, and several times I had to hold my breath, frightened that I would cough and be caught. I do not believe I exaggerate when I say that I lay motionless for half an hour. Yet it took me all that time to make a simple, yet unsettling observation. While I could smell the smoke, indeed, feeling as if I was inhaling just as much as the unseat smoker themselves, I couldn't see it. I would have expected to have seen the smoke rise up and over the rooftop, but not even the slightest wisp was evident. The autumn sky was now dimming, and I grew frustrated as the cold, damp stone below me sent chills through my body. Wishing that I had never gone up there in the first place, I felt hunger approaching, and knew that by now my parents would be worried about me. I persuaded myself that I could at least dip my head over the edge of the roof and quickly take a look to see who was there. Maybe, if they were on the other side of the yard, I could climb down unseen. I slid across the roof as quietly as I could and slowly peered downward, sure not to make any sudden movements to attract attention. There was no one there. The playground was empty, and the darkened windows of the main school building seemed as vacant as they had been before, yet the smell and taste of cigarette smoke still filled my lungs and stung my eyes. Then I witnessed something which rooted me to the spot. A single, curling strand of smoke slid upward through the hole in the roof. Someone was down there. Someone was inside that room beneath me. This seemed impossible. As far as I was aware, there was no way inside. The building had been sealed off perfectly from the outside world. Yet there it was, a puff of cigarette smoke, which escaped first from the mouth of someone unseen below, and then through the hole in the roof to where I had been lying. My triumph finally facing my fear of heights seemed a distant memory, and now all I could think of was getting off that roof to safety down below. But the hole lay between myself and the drainpipe, and, curiosity being as gripping a mindset as any, I decided to take a quick look inside before quietly making my escape and leaving the building behind. As I approached the opening, the smell of smoke grew stronger still, and as I peered inward, the thought of "Don't look!" filtered through my mind. But it was too late. I had looked. At first, there was nothing. The room below seemed darker than it had done before, but this could be explained by the dimming sky, and my eyes adapting to the change. What could not be explained was the noise I heard coming from inside. It seemed distant at first, indistinct and uncertain. Then it gradually took form, to me sounding like someone choking. I smiled to myself, thinking it was probably the cigarette smoke, and that maybe some local kids had a den down there. But then, suddenly, in the gloom, my eyes were drawn to one of the cubicles. Its door was closed, and yet I was not convinced that it had been before. I tilted my head closer to the hole, but my angle of view shrouded the inside from inspection. As the choking sound increased in volume, so did the smell of smoke. Then sound and smell were joined by something which chilled my very soul. I panicked and let out a cry as the door quivered with impact, as of someone violently kicking it from the other side. Smoke now filled my lungs, and my eyes watered. I could barely see anything both inside the building and out. Then it stopped. The choking sound had disappeared, and the smell of smoke had simply vanished. For a moment, I started to think that I had imagined it all. I gasped for air, drawing deep into my lungs, only for terror to take me once more. In the dark silence, in the cold, damp, and forgotten room below, the sound of footsteps in water filled the air. Then the cubicle door slowly began to creak open. I can't say entirely what took place after that. I believe I'd blocked much of it out from my memory. Apparently the headmaster, an intimidating yet kind man by the name of Mr. Mackay, had been in his office working late on the other side of the building. When he was disturbed by the sound of my screams, he rushed outside and found me on the roof, curled up into a ball, paralyzed with fear, sobbing. After some reassuring words, he held me down and took me to his office, where he once again guaranteed that I was safe, and then phoned for my parents to come and pick me up. I trusted Mr. Mackay implicitly, and as I fought the tears back, I described everything which had happened. The roof, the smoke, the cubicle. As I told him my story, the blood drained from my headmaster's face. I've long thought about what he told me in that office after hearing my account. Perhaps he wished to frighten me so that I and others would never venture up there again. And looking back, it does seem to be a strange thing to share with an already frightened child otherwise. But he seemed genuinely disturbed by the events I had conveyed to him. He told me that years before I went to the school, there had been a tragedy there involving a 12-year-old girl, one he refused to name. She had a reputation for being difficult. The teachers tried their best, sympathizing with her, as she came from an abusive background, but they found her almost impossible to control, as she often threatened violence and had been suspended several times for fighting with other students. One day, she decided to skip a class and managed to persuade 2 other girls to join her by promising them each a cigarette. So, as the story went, the girls sneaked away when the bell for class rang. and hid in the toilets. The details of what occurred afterwards were less than forthcoming. But what was clear was that the poor girl had a seizure of some kind and died there and then. The other girls claimed that they had already left before this happened, but there were rumors and accusations, of which most only whispered, but many believed. It was suggested that the girl had been with her friends when the seizure took place, and out of fear of getting caught smoking and skipping class, they lifted their friend into the stall, closed the door over, and then left her there. Whether they believed that she would perhaps recover or not was the subject of much speculation. The scratches and bashes on the inside of the cubicle suggested most definitely that she had continued to convulse while there, perhaps even in an uncoordinated attempt to escape and call out for help. In the aftermath, the building was closed off, and the school and community attempted as best they could to put the tragedy behind them. Perhaps Mr. Mackay made the whole thing up, just to terrify me, taking what I thought I'd experienced and using it to concoct a story designed to scare me away from ever going back to that place. Unfortunately, a few unwelcome things transpired after that. I did indeed avoid the roof of that sealed building at all costs. My fear of heights was nothing compared to the dread which that building then held for me. My schoolmates, of course, did not believe my version of things, accusing me of lying about the entire story just to avoid being made fun of. As far as they were concerned, I never got up there. Lastly, I did have a recurring dream throughout my childhood, one which I would wake from in a cold sweat, curled up in my bed, screaming. I know that in it, I would be lying on that roof, peering down through the hole into that abandoned place. But the memory always seems vague somehow. All that is left is an impression of a cubicle door creaking open and something staring up at me from within.
So yeah, all of that creepy ass footage that you have been watching for the last hour and 40 minutes, that was actually me. I went out today, earlier on, and took those videos of that creepy place. Somebody had told me about it and said, oh, it's abandoned. There shouldn't be anybody or anything around there, so go check it out. And I have to say, I'm glad I went and recorded the video before I recorded the stories this evening. Otherwise, yeah, I think I would have been too freaked out to go there now and take any videos. There was something moving around in there. An animal, I'm guessing. Not a ghost or a human or anybody ready to murder me, but you never know, do you? Well, that's enough for this evening. Back again very soon. Maybe tomorrow. Definitely on Sunday, if not tomorrow. And I do so hope you're going to join me again. You are, aren't you? Of course you are. Well, until the next time, very, very sweet dreams and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.